Where did it go, or did my computer just?
Your computer
oh,
just
just
went to
oh,
sleep,
okay.
yeah. Perfect.
Okay, awesome.
All right, folks. I can shout. Okay. Yay! We changed rooms, and I don't think we lost anybody. We may have gained a few people, so that's great. So, time for our keynote, right? Because we've been hearing all this brilliant stuff, and now we have more brilliant stuff to learn about. So, Jessica Swanson Baker is the daughter of the Leeward Island Archipelago, who works as an assistant professor of ethnomusicology at the University of Chicago. Her first book, Island Time, Speed and the Archipelago, from St. Kitts and Nevis, University of Chicago Press, 2024, traces the sonic history of whalers, an up-tempo style of popular music from St. Kitts and Nevis that surged in popularity in the late 1990s. And I forgot to bring my book for the signature. Sitting right next to my desk, I'm upset. When she's not teaching, writing, or researching, she finds joy in all kinds of singing, mosaic crochet, and improvisational cooking. So, without further ado, here is Dr. Baker.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. Thanks for inviting me, Alex. It's such a pleasure to be at SEMSEC. This is my favorite regional conference. It's among the first conferences I ever went to as a graduate student, and every time I've come, I've just found the conversation to be so illuminating. So the paper that I'm going to give is a paper that I've been working on for a little while. So I hope that if you've seen me talk anytime in the last month, you may have heard this paper already. But it is a little bit different. Every time I give it, I am trying to incorporate new ideas. So I hope it's still interesting to you. But it comes out of my larger research project where I'm thinking about the Leeward Archipelago. I'm really invested, obviously, in thinking about music of the Caribbean, but also thinking about the geography of the Caribbean, how people think of themselves in relation to the geography of the Caribbean, and seeing what's potentially useful about that. And I imagine myself as thinking with a bunch of different scholars. So starting with this book that I read within the last maybe 3 or 4 years, that to me kind of just, you read something good that kind of just shifts the whole thing. So taking sound and south as others of the visual and the north, Gavin Steingo and Jim Sykes, with a compelling cadre of sound thinkers, have called for a remapping of sound studies, or a new cartography of sound theory, as an affirmative gesture that is not just a critique of colonial paradigms, which is necessary, but there's more perhaps, but the application of differently oriented ideas. With this suggestion, they put forth a few characteristics of the new mapping paradigm. They suggest that remapping sound studies requires paradigmatic shifts characterized by robust analyses of what they call multiple liminalogies, border spaces and thresholds beyond which sound cannot be heard. A focus on sonic history as encounters constituted by friction and integration, and they advocate for a more probing awareness of multiplicity, what they call ontological and perspectival, such that we move from a relativist multiculturalist framework, one that assumes culture to be a universal, to multinaturalism, so that different conceptions of being, what they call different ontologies, can figure into our work. Most pressingly, they imagine that this work ought to be done from the South as the cartographic locale of Western modernity's most encompassing other. So as someone who's been focused on the archipelago for the past several years at this point, I respond to this invitation with the suggestion that we think, or at least that we should continue to think with the Caribbean and its geography in order to inch closer to these important counter-cartographic aims. In my work in St. Kitts and Nevis, which is a two-island nation in the Eastern Caribbean, I think of the archipelago as a useful model for apprehending the relationality of time, of musicality, of geography across scales that makes Caribbean performance a meaningful medium for world-making in the present. So where music from small islands like St. Kitts and Nevis could only ever be imagined as receptacles, like recycled, unoriginal music. They're hearing something from someone else and then they kind of jazz it up and now it's a new thing. So they're only understood as versions of what already was and not creators of their own meaning. The archipelago, modeled specifically after the Leeward archipelago, is a dynamic form of interrelated islands, mediating sea, littoral borders, uninhabitable centers that makes alternatives to the idea of origins or cultural ownership and global belonging usefully thinkable within a local geography. So as an alternative, next slide, sorry, I should have been showing you this already. Okay, this is the Leeward Archipelago here circled. Islands that are actually quite close together, that share various kinds of colonial history with one another, definitely sharing sounds, ideas, foods, and even though there are different names for a lot of the same things, there's a real understanding, I think, in this part of the world that there is something that is the same, a kind of subterranean sameness. So as an alternative to the continent, which is big, contiguous, definitive, the archipelago offers partiality, interruption, the idea that a bunch of smaller things make up a larger thing, but smaller, same, but different kinds of things. It's just sort of a kind of form that I find interesting. And that the archipelago allows us to think about this idea, this kind of form, as compatible with wholeness and relation. As an augmentation of what Edward Glissant and a host of others called archipelagic thinking, I've turned specifically to listening, or what I've called archipelagic listening. And there are a few reasons for this, and I actually really welcome your questions interrogating this idea. I feel ready for that emotionally. Which it takes a long time, as you know, when you have an idea, to be ready for people to kind of probe at it. So one reason that I've turned to listening is that I've been enculturated into an understanding of myself as a musician, as the child of many generations of musical people, and my investment in dealing with sound is an inherited obligation. Another is that listening is an action, a tool that moves beyond the visual layer of flat affirmation and into the profound ambiguity of the level at which you think about how things exist. Listening, I think, is a kind of reaching out that does not overdetermine what comes back. And I want to think of archipelagic listening as a tool of intelligibility across the conjuncture of historical events, contemporary relations, sustained affinities, and processes of belonging that draw disparate but resonant experiences together under various banners of belonging. So these banners, like West Indian, Small Islander, Black, European, these are the kinds of things that are negotiated, identities and conceptions of the self and other that are negotiated, that occupy the cultural political space that Paul Gilroy describes as the Black Atlantic. And of course, this is an old text, but a seminal one that I hope my graduate students are still reading, one that I still put on as many syllabi as I can, and that I hope, yes, Dr. B agrees, that you will continue to return to. So in Gilroy's seminal text, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, it was an effort to write against nationalist, ethnically essentialist discourses that sought to position Blackness and Europeanness as mutually exclusive identities. So he's deploying W.E.B. Du Bois's term of double consciousness. Raise a finger if you've heard this term before. Yes, okay, these are my people. To address manners of occupying the space between seemingly incongruous identities. Gilroy introduces the Atlantic as a singular, complex unit of analysis that might produce an explicitly transnational and intercultural perspective. Within this project of moving beyond nationalist versus diasporic or essentialist versus vehemently non-essentialist discourses that position Blackness as an entirely situational non-essence, that's a quote, Gilroy argues that Black expressive culture, particularly manifested as Black music, plays an especially important role. He writes, and excuse me for this long quote, the histories of borrowing, displacement, transformation, and continual reinscription that the musical culture encloses, and he's talking about Black music here, are a living legacy that should not be reified in the primary symbol of the diaspora and then employed as an alternative to the recurrent appeal of fixity and rootedness. Music and its rituals can be used to create a model whereby identity can be understood neither as a fixed essence nor as a vague and utterly contingent construction to be reinvented. Black identity is not simply a social and political category to be used or abandoned. It is lived as a coherent, if not always stable, experiential sense of self. And considering this, I think that where the archipelago acts as a centerless set of islands that are taken, understood, lived, or known together, it stands as a useful metaphor, something that we can think with as a model for an understanding of Blackness, but also of Caribbeanity, of modernity, of really any kind of identity or way of life that we can consider as being part of a kind of fractal piecing together. And some things that, particularly things that are experienced and produced as, and within Black music. This relationship, Gilroy writes, cannot be reduced to a fixed dialogue between a thinking racial self and a stable racial community like a diaspora. Instead, he argues, the original call of Africa or shared enslavement is becoming harder to locate, and our model should recognize that the communicative gestures inherent to Black musicality are not expressive of an essence that exists outside the acts which perform them. Meaning that like a model like a tree, where it's like, you know, we're like a root, it's not a top down, that it has to be something that's more horizontal and kind of directionless in a way. The archipelago then, and archipelagic listening are not just models for the geographic Caribbean, but also of relation across different kinds of scales. No, I'll stay here for a second. In my work, archipelagic listening can account for wider audiences of Black music, the transmission of structures of racial feeling throughout the world, and the increasing specificity and vernacularization, the microist of musics, to borrow Slobin's phrase, that mark new genres and sonic stylings. This is especially important when listening to what Antonio Benitez Rojo calls the rhythmic complexity that gives Pan-Caribbean cultures a way of being. He writes, this polyrhythm of planes and meters can be seen not just in music, dance, and song, and in the plastic arts, but also in the cuisine, in architecture, in poetry, in the novel, in the theater, and bodily expression, in religious beliefs, in idiosyncrasies, that is, in all the texts, he calls all these things texts, that circulate high and low throughout the Caribbean region. If, as Edward Lasant has suggested, the entire world is archipelagoizing and creolizing, and Black musicality continues to play a central role in regional articulations of these processes, then listening with the archipelago, if not an exact science, might merit some consideration. Are you with me so far? Is this making sense? Okay, yes, love that. Thank you for this feedback. Okay, so of course, I'm not the first or the only person to listen with archipelagos. The word and some gesture to the concept of these interrelated objects has cropped up within scholarship writing, the long thrust of music studies relational turn. We all hear about the relational turn in our comprehensive exams, right? An effort to make sense of global entanglement that's been happening for quite some time. In a 2010 article, for example, Georgina Bourne, following philosopher of science Michael Serres, describes spaces of knowledge as islands sown in archipelagos on the noisy, poorly understood disorder of the sea. She advocates ultimately for music scholars to look beyond the archipelago of music subdisciplines toward the knowledge continents of anthropology, sociology, and history. I don't know if I agree with that necessarily, but she's invested in the archipelago for sure. Continental hierarchies aside, this is the kind of interdisciplinarity that has been key to Caribbean music scholarship, I think to really a lot of ethnomusicology. In a more applied and recent example, Michael Denning, in his 2017 book, Noise Uprising, calls on an archipelago of colonial ports to describe the emergence of a diasporic and transnational phonograph culture in the early 20th century. But one of my favorites is from Professor Jocelyne Guibault, who recently retired from the music department at Berkeley, from her 1993 article on Zouk in the West Indies. Without using the word archipelago specifically, Professor Guibault offers what she describes as a reconstruction of musical influences on Zouk. Okay, this is a moment in the 1990s when we're thinking about world music really kind of broadly, and Professor Guibault is like, you know what, music in the Caribbean is world music par excellence. And so at a time when previously folks weren't that interested in the Caribbean because the Caribbean only represented Creoleness. And as ethnomusicologists, we were interested in thinking about like pure cultures that we could trace origins, back to, and the Caribbean wasn't giving that for us, so we weren't interested. And then folks like, there were other people, but we'll talk about Professor Guibault because I'm obsessed with her. But she, in the early 1990s, is invested in the Caribbean as a place of real theorizing with the Caribbean and thinking about all these processes of the like modern global world as happening in this place that we see as kind of irrelevant. And so she uses the archipelago, not the term, but definitely an image of it to do this important work. Okay, so we look at this rendering. It's not that exciting. I imagine if this would happen now, there may be some more interesting kind of drawings that we could do using maybe ChatGPT. But it's a simple rendering, but like any kind of map, there's a spatial logic within. Africa and Europe as places and ideas of origination are at the bottom. General, off in the distance, jazz, orchestral begin, salsa, cadence lipso, represented at different distances, representing Caribbean musical developments throughout the middle of the 20th century. Named social, kinetic, and sonic accumulations or genres of regional music. At the top is the space of the most contemporary. The arrows and the movement they suggest move us toward an understanding of genres as mobile and dispersed, even in their isolation. In a discussion of Cuban rumba circulation in 1960s China, Andrew Jones suggests that we might think of musical genres not as essences or even as particular repertoires, but as vernacular modulations of globally circulating forms. With this in mind, we might see the arrows as representations of any number of circulating mobile forms that was taken up elsewhere. For Guibault, this is most obviously heard in the vernacular modulation of the tercio pattern, ta, 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 which we'll hear in a lot of different kinds of Caribbean music. This, what she calls intellectual movement of this rhythm between islands, instruments across time and sea, mapped in black and white, is represented as an archipelagic relation between genres. A reviewer too might ask, why is it an archipelago and not just a network or a constellation? And my answer first was to cry, and my answer now is to say that French Afro-Caribbean genres represented here are a network. There are hubs, objects, or persons that play a role in more than one cluster or node, like the US Soul. There are hinges, which connect otherwise separate groups like Begin. As a set of connections that link discrete elements, a network is a type of form. And in describing this and other networks as an archipelago, I'm interested in a specific form. I'm trying to put a little bit of phenomenological and affective meat on the bones of this mapped interrelation that she has here. So what is an archipelago? Oh, right, sorry. Let me play you what the Zouk sounds like. I'm so sorry. So they're saying Zouk la c'est le médicament nous nie. Zouk is the only medicine we need. So if you might think of this sound as an archipelagic sound, that's the argument that Jocelyn Guibault is making. And there's obviously other arguments about like how sort of an archipelagic sound becomes something that can rev you up, sustain a body and a people. But that's maybe for another conversation. Okay, so we saw the kind of archipelagic mapping of this. We listened to this archipelagic world music par excellence. What is an archipelago? Put very simply, an archipelago is a set of islands taken together. Like constellations, archipelagos are not eminent or natural categories existing independently of interpretation. There's no set of islands that was kind of born as an archipelago. We take them or understand them as an archipelago. In other words, archipelagos happen, they congeal, they take place. However, unlike, say, a constellation or some other kind of network that we might think of, some geographical archipelagos, like St. Kitts and Nevis, or maybe even Cuba and Miami, the French Caribbean, I'm sure you can think about the Florida Keys maybe, are understood not solely as interpretive images, but as places of inhabitants and material interrelation. And so I've come to understand the archipelago as a form from a set of islands that at their closest are 2 miles apart. And that is St. Kitts and Nevis. And just these are some pictures from St. Kitts and Nevis that just truly just being there, driving up the main road, that you are always confronted with a border and that there's another island close by. And this is not to say that these islands are necessarily very easy to get to. It can be expensive. The Caribbean Sea is choppy. It's terrifying. Depends on whether or not the guy who said he was going to come with the boat actually comes with the boat. But the reality, but it's about kind of an awareness of somewhere else that is also part of this place that I think does something for how folks think about place and origin, where they're from, and where things can be from, and to whom and where they belong. I'm going off on these tangents. Okay, so the Leeward Islands, which include small islands like Montserrat, which is 39 square miles, St. Kitts, which is 69 square miles, meaning it's 25 miles long and 5 miles wide. It's about a half an hour trip to go around the entire island. Nevis, which is 36 square miles, Antigua, as well as smaller islets and cays, they are distinctive in their experiential amplification of the main features of an archipelago. Montserrat, whose namesake serrated peaks are visible from Nevis, is about 30 miles away. On a particularly clear day, Antigua's mountains are visible from the southern handle of St. Kitts, and on a regular drive up the island's main road, the peaks of the islands of Saba and Eustatius appear as if in arm's reach. In the small Leeward Islands, this proximity has been experienced sensorially through the mutual intervisibility, sometimes intertraversability, and definitely the interaudibility of the island spaces. It's been experienced sonically through the development of many fast tempo styles of dance music like jam band, rhythm box, wailers, music from the US Virgin Islands, Antigua, and St. Kitts Nevis respectively. And that's what my book is about. But what I especially like about Professor Guibault's map here is that it just doesn't make me think of music from islands. Let's return to it. It encourages us to think of music as islands. And so like the Leeward Islands and St. Kitts Nevis, I want to think now with one of the genres, Calypso, which could be considered an archipelago in an archipelago, one genre in a sea of ubiquitous sound. So thinking with just this one node on her map. The dash, if we see Calypso, is a kind of, I've called it a Frankenstein, one of the Frankenstein genres of the early 1990s in the Caribbean. We had Polkalypso at one point. The dash we might think of as a kind of border zone in which Dominicans see themselves in the acoustic image of inter-island relation. Perhaps we can think of this dash between Calypso as an isthmus, like Panama, utilized as a strategic space for travel between the Atlantic and the Pacific, sonic extensions of the Caribbean Sea. As a suffix, maybe Lypso takes on a subordinate role to Cadence, mirroring a familiar archipelagic relationship between main island and periphery. If Cadence is, say, Trinidad, Calypso might be Cat Island or Vieques, Tobago or Barbuda. These are all the sort of tiny islands of sort of big island places. They're called subnational island units, I learned recently. So if we're really committed to this archipelagic model, if you kind of rock with me on this for a little bit, how might we map Calypso as an island? Where would we even start if we're thinking of this as an island place? For Gordon Henderson, who is one of the founding members of Exile One, which is a really prominent Calypso band, Calypso came about after a long period of what he called imitation. He noted in a 2020 interview, first we were imitating the Brits, and everyone was wearing turtlenecks like the Beatles. Then we were Black Americans, Afros, funk, all of that. Without over-romanticizing the story of Calypso's emergence, the late 1980s version of the genre, Henderson notes, was a product of an intentional decision to, quote, collaborate, create, and build something closer to home. To sound closer to home, he and his band included rhythmic changes in the drum and bass that most resembled the leaning groove of Haitian compa and the Antillean rhythmic drive referred to very broadly as calypso. In the studio recording of Treyo, and that we'll hear in a second, we hear a tresillo pattern, military-style percussion, and a repetitive call. In a live recording of a performance of Treyo, which means kill them, sometime in the 1990s in metropolitan France, we hear a description of the historical significance, its archipelagic resonances, and an emphasis on l'apocabuit, or traditional communal drumming and jamming, what folk in St. Kitts and other parts of the English-speaking Caribbean would call big drum. So let's hear Henderson describe in his own words the kind of archipelagic resonance of this sound.
Okay, this is carnival time. 12. All right. This song tells the story of the World War II in the Caribbean, when there was a man called Saurin in Guadeloupe and another one called Robert in Martinique, while Pétain was making friends with Hitler here in metropolitan France. You want me to talk to you? All right. So, those who were friends with Pétain, Robert, and Saurin, they called the collaborators, collabo. And those who were friends with Winston Churchill and de Gaulle were part of the resistance. So people from Martinique and Guadeloupe who wanted to be part of the free world, the resistance, had to come over to Dominica to build the resistance. We had to feed all the soldiers. We had to kill the cows, kill the pigs, I'm sorry, Julie, to feed the soldiers. This is why we talk about kill them, trail. We're not talking about killing cops, are we? No, nothing about it. Let's try that again.
Okay, I love this stuff. There's a lot there. Okay, one kind of analysis of Calypso, which is what we're hearing some version of Calypso here. It's live, so it's not as polished as you might hear on an album, but you're hearing the general rhythm and the kind of vibe of the thing, the atmosphere that it's trying to create. One kind of analysis of Calypso, in terms of its archipelagic relations, might layer the history of island-to-island movement the song commemorates with the personal biography of its composer. Henderson's home in Portsmouth, Dominica, in between the French departments of Martinique and Guadeloupe, was, as he's described, so surrounded before transinsular roads in the 1970s that the only way to get from Portsmouth to Rousseau, both major port cities on the north and south ends of the western side of the island, was by sea. If we mapped Cadence-Lipso using Jessica Schwartz's figuration as a socio-sonic accumulation, somewhere in the synthesis of La Pocabuite, Paul McCartney's Turtleneck, and the break of James Brown's Groove, we understand Cadence-Lipso and so many other Caribbean genres as a product of processes of Caribbean creolization, as Jerome Kamal describes it, that is, creative and open-ended incorporation of external elements into the vernacular. Where drawing the line between the internal and external is part of the process, Cadence-Lipso as an archipelago of congealed, taken together, and inhabited creolized sounds gets a little closer conceptually to the genre's island leap I'm trying to make. Islanding is not only talking to or about islands, it's an attempt to work with and think from island life. And this has been an important approach for many Caribbean thinkers. In a few notable examples, the beach walker in particular has been a recurrent figure. For Martinician Glissant, who I mentioned earlier, for example, it's the beach walker, ambling on both land and water, that describes the Creole condition of errantry, an Antillean identity contingent on various mobile relations. For the Bayesian writer Kamal Brathwaite, it is a granny on the north shore of Jamaica whose littoral pedestrianism holds the most meaning and leads him to the neologism tidalectics as a term for the mobility and relationality of modern identity formation. And I'd like to quote Brathwaite here at a bit of length, because I think the takeaway from tidalectics often overshadows what I see as the more pressing point of the small anecdote. So the snippet comes from a 1993 conversation staged between Brathwaite and Jamaica writer Nathaniel Mackey in New York City. It was published with the insertion of snippets of dialogue with poetry, criticism, and instructive imaginary voices in what Brathwaite called a psychorax video style. Intended to convey the sound of language through visual representation, Brathwaite's style extends the initial insights of the transcribed conversation to alter the graphic conventions of writing, expressing the auditory qualities of language. So in a really kind of psychedelic mixture of fonts and typesettings, he writes, "What is the Caribbean?" Do I have this here? I don't, okay. What is the Caribbean? What is this archipelago, these beautiful islands? He says, the image that gives me the answer is one day on the north coast of Jamaica, we're staying in a house on a cliff overlooking the ocean. And this is a sandy situation. The yard where we're staying, it's a humble, it is not a Jamaica North Coast bikini situation that you would go to tomorrow or Thanksgiving. This is not the North Coast or the Great Holes. This is not James Bond GoldenEye in tourism. This is an old yard, okay? And this old woman is sweeping the sand of her yard away from her house. Traditional early morning woman of the Caribbean history. She's going on like this every morning, sweeping this sand, of all things, away from sand, sand from sand. And I say, now, what is she doing? What's this labor involved with? Why is she laboring in this way, all this time? Because I get the understanding that she somehow believes that if she doesn't do this, the household, that poverty-stricken household of which she's part, probably head of, would have somehow collapsed. So she's in fact performing a very important ritual, which I couldn't fully understand, but which I'm tirelessly trying to. And then one morning I see her body silhouetting against the sparkling light that hits the Caribbean at the early dawn, and it seems as if her feet, which all along I thought were walking on the sand, were really walking on the water. And she was traveling across that middle passage constantly, coming from where she had come from, in her case Africa, to this spot in North Coast Jamaica where she now lives. That was the answer to my question. The meaning of the Caribbean was in that humble, repetitive action. So in this story, colonialism and the island condition register as the Nana's embodied movements as she sweeps. Her labor at the edges, persistent, inexplicable, are not acts of resistance to imitations of or responses against or with mobile flows. It's actually, I think, something else. The sweeping has another kind of role. And in doing this work, we may locate this Nana, as I locate my own maternal grandmother, Julia Eglantine Leader, at multiple edges as a border worker. So I know in the title of this talk, I have the idea of the border worker, and I don't say this word very much, but I'm wanting to think about these people who are congealing archipelagos, who do the work of a kind of conjoining as doing a kind of border work, who are interested and invested in themselves as participating in various kinds of archipelagos. And so Mother, my grandma, she was called Mother by everyone who knew her, was born and raised in Irishtown Bay Road in Bastyr, St. Kitts. Irishtown is a Black, poor neighborhood that abuts the Bay Road, which traces the contour of the southeast section of St. Kitts. Named during its time as an impoverished and crime-ridden section of Bastyr, where formerly indentured Irish servants lived in the 18th century, Irishtown, along with the nearby neighborhoods of McKnight and Newtown, is among the most densely populated neighborhoods that make up the historically urban zone of Bastyr. Forbidden from attending school after her 11th birthday so that she could make money for her family to put her brothers through school, she was sent to go mind 2 dogs, Pip and Rover, for a wealthy family in town. A mother by her 16th birthday and a single mother of 10 before her 30th, Mother believed deeply in cleanliness, proper English, God, and decorum. With her Blackness and womanness pushing her to the edge of many conceptions of humanity, and her poorness and the smallness of her island home relegating her to the edges of society, to modernity, and to time, I often wondered, as I was learning how to be a woman as the only daughter of her daughters, why is she laboring this way? Why must I labor this way? The sweeping, which is, of course, a stand-in for the litany of rules surrounding appearance, manners, habits of eating, speaking, being, doing your hair, but also of caring, feeding, and crafting, making a life for people. These are actions of self and life-making at multiple edges. These are acts of border work. As social theorist Christina Sharp says of her own mother, there are ways that she tried to make a small path through the wake. So I've come to understand, to hear, to listen to other liminal spaces where the sweeping may be singing, it may be dancing, sounding out, whining to a sweet rhythm, drumming on a school desk. Compulsive responses to what Jamaican cultural theorist Nadia Ellis describes as a persistent sense of the insufficiency of existing modes of belonging, an awareness that new forms remain inspiringly elusive. It's hard to make new stuff out of nowhere. No one really is doing that. So the sweeping, the dancing, the singing sand from sand, this is how I think of my own work on Weilers, a genre I love and have been thinking about for a decade, but still struggle to describe with any generality. It is, more than a sound, a set of practices, I think a set of border work practices that aestheticize exactly this persistent sense of present insufficiency. Take the 1997 song, Weiler song from the New Vibes band called Street Style, for example. Nowhere near the breakneck pace of newer Weilers, but still a classic, the song represents a moment of emergence for the style as its own distinctive vernacular entity. The lyrics articulate how important the music, the local music, we music as they call it, is to the well-being of the youth, particularly as it is something new. The newness here is in the energy of the drive created by overlapping riffs and lines in the rhythm that double one another, creating new alignments between parts of the dense amalgam. I think of that as also kind of archipelagic listening. A deep brassy saxophone sound speaks in unison with the lead singer, voicing an affirmative uh-huh together. Synthesized whistle sounds ornament throughout. Each iteration of the chorus is different. Mr. Mention sings, "We don't want to jam with no timpan no more." And then he says jam band, referencing more traditional regional iterations of carnival processional music, like the steel pan or impromptu or ad hoc jam bands that got together, especially around the Christmas season. He laments, "They always play something we've heard before. I want to jump it in street style, a new style." The desire for a new and different is satisfied over a rhythm that sounds and feels like the roving big drum bands. The desire to hear something new is not a plea for radical rupture. Instead, it is predicated on a license to creatively engage with the past, or even the present, unfettered reinvention of what is in search of what could be. I'll play you an example of what that sounds like.
Give me remember Marshall, the place, man. Has been a mix of the jump and tip and sound. Have a look at the boy. This one I call the street style. All the man who knows they know that, so now go on to sing. From in a mix up in a cover sound. From in a street style and in the number one jump. From in a say that we don't give. I looked over yonder and what did I see? People balling out and making a plea to me. They say without the vibes in the music it's empty, so nobody listens, don't let it be. Cultivate the music I play. Give me the street style all the way. It must be vibes and feel and hair. Got the people jumping everywhere. Play the vibes. In the music we delight, one more vibes. Only the vibes could make it right. Play the vibes. Hide it down in the bush and no play the vibes. Cause the people.
Okay, so if the beach walker is the figure of choice for an older generation of Caribbean poetics, the street processionist, a carnival chipper, a masquerader, a junkanoo stamper, a road fret warrior, is, I think, the post-colonial contemporary Creole border walker. Most emblematically, a young, healthy woman in St. Kitts and Nevis and in much of the Afro-Caribbean, the street-style road walker can be found walking up or whining in her vernacular style to vernacular sounds. And where the labor or bodily exertion of whining is referenced plainly as work or walk in St. Kitts, Kamau Brathwaite's question resounds: why is she laboring in this way? How might we think of this kind of work as a street possession, as marching in a carnival, as whining your body, as also a kind of border work, a kind of border work as labor? So much Caribbean music, especially Wailers or soca, cadence lypso, in its encouragement of and sonic accompaniment to various forms of whining and walking to marching, participates in a labor of pleasure or self-identification for dancers. As an example of what Paul Gilroy called the politics of transfiguration, Caribbean music in its celebration of revelry, togetherness, and the work and walk of pleasure describes and trains and contextualizes the new modes of friendship, happiness, and solidarity that could be realized in some version of the future. So we might understand Wailers and street style in its own archipelagic relation to other street-based Caribbean styles like Jamaican pasa pasa or Dominican merengue de calle. As Michael Birnbaum Quintero writes of practices of sounding at the limits, the technological and human borders of extreme volume in Buenaventura, Colombia, Wailers as a street style that operates at the limits of history and tempo is a bid for a certain kind of sovereignty. This sovereignty, at least as a sonic practice, does bear some utilitarian resemblance with grannies sweeping at the limits. We might think of MIDI synthesizers, jailbroken cell phones, and homemade sound systems as the brooms, the tools for the embodied labor of making life at the borders. Okay, let's wrap up. So let's turn to the Zouk Archipelago again. You've been staring at this image for a while, long enough perhaps that you might be able to close your eyes or lower your gaze and imagine it, or at least think with it. It might be easier if you overlay your own cartography of who you think you might be, the music that you think is interesting, whatever your research is. And imagine now that the arrows in between each genre, each vernacular modulation multiply exponentially and in every direction. The blank spaces in between each node are filled with tiny arrows back and down, deep into the unknown, behind, under, before what you can see on the surface. What if the arrows and their flows were both chaotic and unpredictable on the one hand, and also subject to specific known and measurable thrusts and vectors? Transatlantic slavery, neoliberalism, viral TikToks, hurricanes, global warming, microplastics, but also the Black Atlantic embrace of James Brown, the ubiquity of the clave, the human necessity for dance and musicking. In this case, could the arrows be so small, so multiple, so forceful that we imagine them as molecules of water, so densely packed together that we envision them as the sea? That's kind of the work that I'm interested in. I've come to thinking with the sea, I've come to think of much of my scholarly practice as a kind of wake work. thinking, I think I might have skipped a page here. I'm sorry, y'all. Stick with me. I'm missing a page of my talk, so that's okay. You know what? Okay, so I've been reading a lot of Christina Sharp, and Christina Sharp talks about being in the wake. Is anyone familiar with this text? Yeah, okay. So she uses the wake as a metaphor for thinking about how we're kind of living in the aftermath of different kinds of disaster. She's thinking largely about like transatlantic slavery, but different types of disasters that we are continuously living in the wake. And when she thinks about the wake as kind of like what a ship or a boat leaves in the water as a trail, kind of rippling effect of something after. She also uses the metaphor of the wake as thinking about like a wake of when like a loved one dies and you're sitting with your dead. So she does a kind of something that I love, as you can tell. She's doing big, sweeping, metaphorical kind of flip to ask us what does it mean to do work that sits in the wake, that sits with our dead, that thinks with kind of past traumas, and how can that help us think about how our work can be beholden to people? Who are we beholden to? Who is it that we're invested in, and why do we do this work? And so I've been thinking very much with the archipelago, not only because I've done field work in the Caribbean and because I'm an ethnomusicologist and that's what I'm supposed to do, but also because I think of this landscape, this archipelagic landscape as one that I come from and that I feel a sort of obligation to keep returning to think about how it might be useful or helpful in some way. So this is a picture of a commemorative bench for my grandmother, who I just talked about, that she has a plaque that reads, "From my aunts and uncles, embracing our ancestral landscape," that looking out into the sea is they imagine as something as an ancestral landscape. And that brings me back to this idea that if I'm born into something that I've inherited sort of this landscape, what does it look like to do music research from that kind of place? And so I know that coastal erosion has changed the shape of the shoreline, but looking out across the sea and onto other islands offers something, I think. I want to be clear that I know that music, with all of its effective mobilization power, is not capable of serving as the sole catalyst for the kinds of collective action that might affect immediate change to any of the many terrifying vectors of death and suffering, ecological ruin that are contributing to our collective fear of the future. The feeling that everything is moving too fast toward a terrifying end. Right now, my efforts have turned in this way to finding ways of supporting more ethnography, music and otherwise, undertaken by people from the Caribbean, so that we have things, objects, ideas, and sounds to think with in doing this work. Which I think is an important move toward gathering insight from folks experiencing an increasingly global set of conditions in the island. But still, I have some emotional investment in the potential of an archipelagic vision of the world. I've been, quite frankly, moved that the way that I teach, the way that I imagine myself, quite frankly, stealing from the university, using my research funds, using my work to give to people to make it so that music can happen in spaces that they otherwise wouldn't, is really, I get this from thinking about the archipelago as a kind of form that allows me to think of myself as the same kind of unit. I do feel really potentially positive about the archipelago as a model for class consciousness, for the idea that we are in a really similar set of contexts and that we are interrelated. So being changed by the practice of archipelagic listening, this border spaces, its imaginary opens up of a capacious drawing together of friction and of generative encounter makes, I think, the Caribbean an audacious space for fathoming and sounding at the borders and for doing important border work. Thank you.
And so I want to open it up. I thought I was loud enough. Okay, so I want to open it up for questions, comments, just whatever. And Emily, hopefully if we get any folks sending us messages over YouTube. Oh, and we have a mic back there. So let's start.
Testing. Yes, we have a microphone. All right, I will get you the microphone. Accessibility, we love it. Gotta have it.
Thank you. Great presentation. I was wondering, I loved your comment at the end about thinking possibly using this in like a class-conscious like positionality, and my brain's been mush. Like conceptually, I'm like, yes, I want this. That'd be really cool. I was wondering if like that's something that you have a little bit more on, and it's like something you might feel comfortable just expounding on a little bit at the moment.
Specifically on class consciousness?
Yeah, like the archipelago as like a model for class consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, so in the Caribbean, we have a lot of, I think, historical examples of that. Maybe the largest one would be when like various Caribbean islands in the early 1960s, late 1950s, early 1960s, were invested in thinking about how they can think about the nation as an archipelago, like moving toward independence movements and trying to make something happen. That obviously, the Caribbean, this was the Federation project, that obviously failed as like something that could coalesce and sustain. But then I think, like if we think about In the Wake, there are definitely different ripples of that. We have CARICOM, which is another kind of organization of like Caribbean islands trying to think like, how can we think across borders? But that's obviously, oh gosh, thinking more nationally. In terms of class consciousness on like a more individual level, I think that we might think about like carnival music and dance hall, like these kinds of Caribbean genres that invariably come from poor, largely Black people, as a kind of sound that is doing a kind of work of having people recognize that they are participating or like experiencing the same kind of circumstances across borders. I feel like I can't speak too much on, I feel like I can't give you like a particular example of like this one community is, because they've thought of the archipelago that now they're, like kind of like collectively marching forward. But I will say that that has been an important thrust of Caribbean scholarship, like this idea, like C.L.R. James talks extensively about this idea that the Mighty Sparrow, is a very popular Calypsonian, is the kind of character that we need in order to galvanize people. And I think that we can see the Caribbean is also a place with a lot of experimentations of how musicians can become politicians. Haiti's a great example of that. The Dominican Republic is a fantastic example of that. So I'll say more that I think the Caribbean is a space where we can see a lot of experimentation there's a real relationship between music, politics, class consciousness. And perhaps if we're comfortable with failure as also being really able to tell us something, then I think it's a useful space to think with. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
We actually have a question from YouTube from
Cool.
Abby Lindo. She said, I recently had the pleasure of visiting St. Kitts and wonder how you go about addressing the geographic realities in the region in your analysis of sound.
The geographic realities.
In the region that you're studying through your analysis of sound.
Yeah.
Yeah, Abby, if you have more. She was trying to keep it short for you too.
Yeah, no, understood.
We'll come back to Abby.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baker. I really enjoyed this. Yeah, pleasure to hear about your work, and congratulations on the book and all of this. My work is in North Africa, and Jonathan Glasser in 2016, University of Chicago came out with a take on Andalusi communities, also through this idea of the archipelago across North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, just also coming from sort of a being in the wake, like a very helpful metaphor here as well about living with the traumas, in this case of Jewish and Muslim communities fleeing, political persecution and division and being pushed out of Andalus, and coming and establishing these urban centers, but working in this way of forming an archipelago. And also, so this idea of sitting with the dead, this is very very meaningful to think through. And this question is half-baked, so I'm so sorry. But so compared to this idea of an archipelago across land, geographical land of North Africa, still within these urban centers, but very much sort of disconnected in space, but very connected through networks as you're raising, congealed in some ways. And then the idea of the archipelago across an ocean. I'm just wondering, based on your thinking and how you're using these concepts, what you might say about the difference between an archipelago across land versus an archipelago across a sea. Any ideas? Thank you so much.
When you say an archipelago across land, what do you mean?
I mean, the way you hear.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the question is, what do I mean by archipelago
Yeah, just
across
so I-
land?
yeah.
So Jonathan Glasser uses this concept to think about how these communities are self-contained, sort of like islands in
Got
this
it, okay.
sense, based on expressive practices coming from a particular kind of history. So they share that this is the congealing, sort of how does this congeal? But they are separated by such distances, and he thinks about these as all connected across the region.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, one of the things that I attempt to do is to think of the sea as not just kind of blank space. I think that's one of kind of the thrusts of, I guess, like continental modernity, this idea that continents are big, important places, and so that if we want to think about things as related, we have to think about like a contiguous landmass. And that so that the sea sort of gets inscribed as like this sort of empty space where nothing happens, but the sea has a real materiality to it, obviously. And so I guess maybe I would say that like metaphorically the relationship is that it like thinking with islands, like this archipelago as a sea of islands forces us to deal with what goes in between these nodes. Like it's great to say, that these kind of like islands of spaces are interrelated as a network, but then it makes us think, well, what actually materially or thought-wise, conceptually is the stuff, that is the stuff that is linking these landed spaces. Also, I would say that there's obviously some difference. I'm trying to make an argument about like literally being on an island that's small enough that it feels like an island all the time. That there is something like psychically that happens there in the way that you think about place. I would be curious about how that would map onto like a landed kind of or a more metaphorical, less kind of experiential archipelago. But really the point is about thinking that with the archipelago as a model, like a really specific kind of model that has edges and sea and a kind of transport in between. And so that if we think with that it forces us that even if we're thinking with like a kind of more extrapolated version of the archipelago, that it gives us a fuller model that we have to think through all the different pieces of it and not just say they're related, because we know they're related, but it's like how and through what mechanisms. That's a great question, thank you.
All right, so I got some clarification.
Okay, okay.
She said to tell you thank you for your talk and that she was sorry she could not be here.
No worries.
But her question was really, I think, from what I understand, trying to ask about how you address geographic sameness and difference in the way you now analyze the sounds of this region.
Yeah, geographic sameness and difference. Well, I mean, one of the arguments that I make in the larger work is about speed as becoming really important for really small islands to distinguish their music. The idea that it kind of like brings in a different vector of what music is. Like, I feel like people aren't typically sort of like resting their hats on tempo, that in the Caribbean we'll say like this rhythm is rumba, this is salsa, this is reggae. These instruments are from this place. If I hear an accordion, I know that I'm in the Dominican Republic or a Dominica kind of thing. And that in the smaller islands, that it's not really that way. We're using all the same instruments and the same words, but it's just sort of slightly different. So maybe that's one way that I think about geographical sameness and difference, is by thinking through something like tempo that seems sort of esoteric. But also one of the other arguments is that the archipelago is an archipelago because so much is the same, and that it is like Antonio Benitez Rojo's idea of the repeating island. It's a meta archipelago, we all have the same dish, but like you only know it's different because you taste it and there's like an addition of one thing, or it's served at this time of day. And these are things that I think allow the Caribbean to be understood as an archipelago. And it's the sameness. It's the fact that we can see like a least common denominator as repeating across this space, that we can understand it as something that's taken together and that we can understand together. That's sort of a long-winded answer. You can ask her if that was.
Hi, thank you so much. This was so inspiring. I was wondering, you were talking a lot about like the arrows between, like on the chart, and like between the islands and stuff. I was wondering if you could talk about changing transportation as impacting perception of how far-reaching the archipelago is. Because even in the picture that you just had on the board, we had cruise ships and sailboats and everything, and you talked about like the currents between islands and limiting like how far you can go.
Absolutely. That's something that certainly has happened in waves in the Caribbean. I talk in the introduction of the book about the fact that St. Kitts felt really remote and far away. When I was growing up, there were no direct flights there, that you had to go through Puerto Rico. Now you can get a $400 flight from JetBlue, in a sort of easy kind of way. That this is also happening in movement between islands. That in fact, there are some historians that say that like in the 19th century, these islands were much more easily intertraversable via like canoe than they are now because of various sort of visa entry policies, really strict immigration ideas, different version, like just plain out racism about who gets to go where. I'm thinking again here about like the Dominican Republic and Haiti. But you asked specifically about transportation. I feel like, that's kind of, that these are things that happen in waves. In the 1960s, the Canadian government was funding ships that were moving between the Caribbean islands that stopped, I think, sometime in the mid-1970s. So then in the 60s, we can hear in the music that there's more movement between like Jamaica and somewhere like St. Croix than there would be in the 1990s when that kind of movement is not happening. It also means that, that like only a certain kind of middle class or aspirational person is moving between these places. Unless, your friend has a fishing boat, and, it makes the journey between these places different. And that's something that I feel like I don't give enough texture to really in the text. This attempt to write the first book about music in St. Kitts and Nevis, and to do it because my dad asked me to, and to honor my granny, and to get tenure, and to do it well. There's a lot of things that I feel like I had to kind of sort of like brush over. And I think that's a really great point about like who gets to move and in what ways. So thank you for asking that question.
I want to go next. I've been holding myself back. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of the yard, right? That you raised with Brathwaite and the image of the granny. And I was thinking about the yard and the wake, when you brought up the wake as well, the idea of cleaning that yard space because it may serve as an Orisha yard or a space for a puja, right? And that's where we're going to have the bongo dance when we have the wake, right? So this whole idea of why is she doing this work as a thing, as a contributing to her community by cleaning that space for community events.
Yeah.
Right, so I was wondering if, how are you thinking about that yard some more?
Yeah,
if you can explore that some more.
I love that. I really hadn't thought beyond just the act of it, because that to me is what seemed most like music making. It's like not for a thing, it does something, it does clear a space And what happens in that space, I guess, could go in any number of directions, whether it be, you know, like a concert, we're coming together so we can make money because like there's disaster relief, or because we're just really feeling it, or because we're drunk, or because it's Christmas. So I really like this idea. I hadn't thought of setting up space for other kinds of rituals. So I guess I don't know. Do you have any kind of?
I mean, there's a lot of talk about that idea of, especially in the Trinidad context, what that yard served as.
Yeah.
So an Orisha yard doubling as a carnival tent, or a place where a pan yard kind of gets birthed. But also really physically, that's where when you have a wake, you have to clean the yard so that you can have the bongo dances to celebrate the death of the person. So yeah, and there's Perlentu Springer writes about this concept of yard space as opposed to formal education sites.
Absolutely.
So anyway, that's me.
That's helpful, thank you.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I feel like every time I hear you speak, I come up with like 7 new ideas for my own work. And, you know, working in the Caribbean, it's sort of related to just different area of the Caribbean, I guess. But I have like 7 questions. I'm going to narrow it to 1.
Okay.
In thinking about the idea of the archipelago and the space where this border work happens, where do you see like digital media, social media, music platforms, Spotify, YouTube, especially in the context of the larger sort of global music industry, and how many of these genres have become sort of beyond what they were in where they were developed, right?
Yeah.
They've become this sort of larger pantheon of things that sort of transcend to this bigger global idea. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the concept of these digital spaces in this archipelagic model.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks.
I mean, I see them as tools as of a kind of archipelagic listening. Obviously, it gets tricky, right? Because I think I have a tendency, and this comes out of a desire, to really think about these things as like liberatory, you know, or like I want to think into their potential. But obviously, you know, once you put something on Instagram or TikTok, it's already sort of been moved in other directions. It becomes a kind of commodity. But I still think of them as tools of a certain kind of archipelagic listening, like literally connecting people to other folks that they can imagine are like them, but now you're seeing and hearing that there is a likeness. But also for building a different kind of consciousness of the Caribbean, of where the Caribbean is, of like how certain kinds of Caribbean dances in particular move. I have another paper that I talk about women who are whining on the internet. For women in particular who are not, in a lot of cases in various parts of the Caribbean, or I'll talk about St. Kitts because I know that best, are not paid for the whining that they're doing on a stage, which is what's bringing people to the shows, is women whining. It is male producers who are looking at women whining to come up with like rhythms, to come up with lyrics, but they're not really compensated for this kind of invisible labor, what I call like the wuck. And so I think that social media and different kind of internet platforms insert a kind of compensation that I think is necessary and not happening elsewhere. But like aside from the kind of material, like money layer of things, there's also an idea that women are watching each other whine and are recognizing that this form that is denigrated at home, that I'm told that I'm too fast and that I shouldn't do this and this is a waste of time, I should go work at a bank, that I'm seeing that this can be useful, but that is also related to what someone else is doing in Brazil. And that it gives it a kind of depth of meaning that I think it also does kind of important work for people for thinking of who they are. But also it also adds copyright law in a place that it wasn't originally, for genres like this that take so heavily from everywhere. It also stifles a kind of creativity. So for sure, it ends up being its own kind of sea-like mediating space with a lot of different layers, but one that I think people, like everything, find really useful. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Okay, I've been trying to hold my question together. My question is actually related to a little bit of what Abigail raised on YouTube and also what you respond to. I remember one of your older presentations as well. So you talk about dealing with the issue, and I'm actually asking what's in your book a little bit, how you deal with among the smaller islands where tempo and speed becomes a distinctive factor, where people have similar sounds, like Zouk kind of sounds like soca, but oftentimes tempo tends to be how some of these islands differentiate themselves, like speeding it up even faster, even more furious sounding, to kind of point to an island identity that's different from, to make that distinction. So I have that there. I want to kind of line it up to possibly, do you think about adding, or have you added timbre to that equation? Because when I think about, even what you played the first song, the Zouk song, you have how they treat bass. And I want to point to a graduate student paper we saw yesterday by Diritu Kuragu, talking about bass as the basis for sound studies. How some of these islands also use the timbre aspects of what the bass is doing. Bass is there, but how, for example, in a Zouk track versus a soca track, how they treat the levels of bass drums, melodic bass, mellow rhythms, and then high ends. Because when we think about Zouk, when we think about compa, you have lots of synthesizer sounds on the higher ends, and how those things kind of become markers. Even though things sound similar, they become these markers. And this comes from, of course, for me, during the pandemic, compa TikTok was one of my things. And I just noticed the patterns, and I'm like, they were very same, but you were like, I can tell we're in Haitian compa town versus anything else because of how they treated their synthesizers and how they treat their tempos. And then across the Caribbean, you have these things. So does that come out in your work? Or can we be looking for that? Or?
Yeah, you should be looking for that, and I should be talking more about that. I mean, the way that I talk about timbre is largely, I'm thinking about the specific kind of like high, ping-pongy, synthesized steel drum sound that I think really defines this music, or at least it did for about 10, 15 years. I don't really write, at least yet, about like the specific kind of bass, and I think a lot of that comes from just the field work that I was able to do. I think being a young woman in her early 20s trying to do field work around a bunch of men meant that there were a lot of spaces that I just couldn't be in, or like that people literally just weren't answering my questions. I think that I could go back now. I'm older, and I think that people respect me enough to take my questions about what's actually happening seriously. So that is something that I am really invested in. I would love to sit in somebody's studio and feel safe enough to engage in that way. But for sure, the same way that tempo is something that it's kind of hard to pin down, it's really sort of a subjective feeling of something that becomes so integral to the sound. Absolutely timbre, the kinds of synthesizers. I do talk a bit about like the different kinds of drum machines that folks are using, the different keyboards that become available at different times that like have specific sounds that, you know, like really mark particular kinds of moments. But I'm sure there's like what you're talking about is sort of a sensitivity to the technology. I'm sure is part of it that I feel like I just don't know yet. Yeah, well, maybe an article. Yeah.
All right, I have the pleasure of apparently reading the last question of this session.
Okay.
This is also from the YouTube live stream. This is from Pablo Herrera-Veitia. He says, Professor Baker, thank you for this wonderful talk. Your notion of archipelagic listening speaks of a sensorial conception of continuities across islands. Could you expand on the clave as an experience factor? And he says his question is referring to the question of time, rhythm, and borders as embodied.
Can you read the last part of the question one more time, please?
Yeah, can you expand on the clave as an experience factor in terms of time, embodiment?
The clave is an experience factor. Interesting. Well, I mean, okay, so I think that the clave is one of the most prevalent kind of pan-Caribbean rhythms that allows us, that helps us know that the Caribbean is related in some kind of meaningful way. I think that the clave is something that you kind of, even if you're not hearing, something that you kind of can clap and feel and snap out kind of internally to the music is an important part of why it feels so ubiquitous. I don't know, I'm not really sure exactly how to answer that question, but I do think it speaks to the way that like what we're hearing kind of gets into our bodies and makes us think or like sort of believe something sort of primordial about who we are in our relationship to the music. And that Caribbean rhythms like have the tendency to do that. And we also talk about them in that way. So we also kind of like reify this idea. And I think that there's something like meaningful and potentially really useful to that, particularly as people continue to call on it. I'm not sure that I have much more about the clave specifically, but I appreciate the question. Yeah.
Okay, so. Okay, just because.
Sorry, thank you so much. This is like a lot of questions, I know, but I've been thinking about this. We had a guest come from St. Martin last year, and they were sharing how there's a song in St. Martin where every new hurricane that comes, they add another verse to the song. So it just keeps getting longer and longer and longer. And so I want to ask if, like really playing into the metaphor here, do the specific vulnerabilities of the archipelago play into your model in any way?
That's a really good question. Maybe not so much in the model itself, but in the argument that I'm trying to make about a kind of awareness of the archipelago. Like I'm trying to move away from an argument that says that like these people live on islands and therefore everything they do is islandy, and instead suggesting that there is something very specific and really kind of emphatic, amplified about living in an archipelago and living on an island. And vulnerability is so key to that. Like, you know, like sort of the awareness, like, you know, people live in Manhattan are also on an island, but there, you know, there's sort of a lack of, you mean like there's a different kind of vulnerability, but, you know, this sort of awareness of the edges of like the sea, of hurricanes, of the possibility of disaster, and also a real memory of those things. You know, that like people, when I'm talking to people doing oral history, folks don't have pictures of very close their parents because they were washed away or because of flood. That the idea that during hurricane season that like things won't be able to move in and move out, that, you know, like there is a real awareness of vulnerability. And so I would say, yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think more about how like the general kind of portable model would take vulnerability into consideration. I think that's a really fantastic question. But definitely vulnerability is kind of like you can't really get around it in thinking with people, I think, in islands like in St. Kitts and Nevis. That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
So I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. This was a fantastic talk. And yeah, just fantastic. So,
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can I say very quickly that I am accepting actual feedback and critique on this? I would love to figure out how this, you know, like where the argument, I know I'm trying to stuff kind of a lot of islands into one thing. So if like for lunch or something, if you have ideas, I really am open to them. I really would love, I love SEMSEC. I really like sharing my work in this space, so please, yeah.
Because we're the cool kids, right?
You guys are the cool kids.
Okay, so a couple housekeeping things. This talk will be posted again on our Facebook page. I know it's not X or Instagram or whatever. We're old people, we use Facebook. So it's SEM. Dr. Johnson, remember SEM? Yeah, because I'm also old.
This is for the YouTube audience as well. We're on Facebook. You can find us on Facebook by looking up SEM Southeast Caribbean. We made it simple. So once again, it's SEM Southeast Caribbean. It's basically one word. If you have the full www.facebook.com/SEM Southeast Caribbean / you can find where we're going to post this video. You also can post videos and news when you pass those comps, get that ABD, get that grant. This is all our regional Facebook posts, so you can put things there, but just aware if you want someone to view our keynote from this year, as well as photos from this year, we will be on our Facebook page. Thank you.
So, now we're supposed to be moving to the lunch workshop. So please, let's proceed to workshop time. All right, thank you.
Thanks for having me.